And good morning again. Let's give a nice welcome to our two panelists from Nigeria this morning. Chris Folayan and Tonye Cole. For Africa, by Africa, New Partnerships for Growth. It's fantastic to be back at the Africa Global Business Forum. I think this is my fourth year participating, and I have to congratulate the Dubai Chamber because every year that I come, it grows bigger in size and scale, and I think it's reflective of the partnerships between the Middle East and Africa, but in particular here, the UAE in Africa. I always suggest that the UAE serves as a grand connector between the Middle East and the continent, doing so with airlines and with ports, with the family trading groups, with hospitality, and it's now come to life. I think it's fair to say that Dubai and Abu Dhabi are almost the second homes for Africans that are leaping into Europe and use this as the great connector. So this strategy that's been laid out for the last 10 years has come to the fore. In the context of Africa, I think it's worth going back 20 years since I first started visiting the continent. And it was a policy driven by aid and driven primarily by institutions, Washington and the UK leading that effort, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the African Development Bank in cooperation with those two organizations in the guise of aid instead of trade. I think trade is an important component, but what I think has radically changed over the last 10 years, and the two of you are clearly evidence of that, is it's the entrepreneur culture that has taken hold on the continent, and clearly the largest economy in Africa is Nigeria, and with a great population for consumer-led growth. Now, I brought that up because there's an interesting dichotomy taking place in the last 4 or 5 years that we know extremely well in the Middle East. The commodity boom that lasted for a better part of a decade that created the emerging market burst in the world has drawn to a close, and now we seem to be entering a new normal for not only oil and gas prices, but commodities right across the board. So it is a challenge for Africa now to be not overly dependent on commodities, but to diversify into the consumer market and attract investment outside of the commodity sector as well. I think it's a critical window. Tonye, would you agree with the premise now that we almost were lulled into growth, lulled into an African renaissance that was overly dependent on commodities, and your group is involved in Sahara in commodities. Is it important now to seize the opportunity to diversify on Africa trade and investment?
You know, so first, I don't think we have a choice. It's something that absolutely must happen. And when oil prices and commodity prices fell and collapsed completely, for me personally, it was one of the best things that happened to Africa. Because first and foremost, it forced everyone to think differently, to begin to look inwards and ask hard questions which we were not asking before. Now, when you had commodities and you were exporting commodities, then it's probably the easiest way of getting foreign exchange without thinking about what you have to do. But those questions were hard. They were difficult questions. What do we do? Do we continue this way? And for me, my prayer was that oil had to just stay low for at the very least 3 to 5 years. Thereafter, it might start rising again. And we've seen the change. We've seen a force in Nigeria, for example, where the government policy changed drastically into agriculture, changed into diversification of power and letting power go, and those kind of things, that's energy, electricity, those kind of things we need to see a lot more on the continent. One other thing that happened with commodity prices coming down, we do inter-Africa trade as well. We saw that other countries began to open up and allow Africans coming from different parts to come into those countries and work. So we saw in this period, in the last 3 years, East Africa opening up completely to Nigerian companies coming in, and we found ourselves in Tanzania, in Uganda, in Kenya, working out of Zambia, and all of these countries opened up because commodity prices shut down. So it's huge. It's huge for Africa.
Oh, that's fascinating. Let me follow up quickly with you then. Prior to that commodity correction, there was less interest in taking Africa to Africa trade. So
Absolutely.
There's a new mentality then that we can do it on the continent alone.
So what you saw prior to that was that at the very most you would work within your economic bloc. And so for the last 20 years, we have been working in Senegal, in Ivory Coast, in Ghana, which forms the ECOWAS West Africa Economic Zone. And you would find that South African zones, people worked in there, or in the East African zones, the East Africans worked together. And you found then that it was much easier for you to do trade with North-South trade rather than East-West trade. And so you would see the Americans, the Europeans, the Chinese, and all of that, that kind of trade going on with Africa, but very little inter-Africa trade. All of that has changed a lot in the last 3 years. Today, you're now seeing connectivity between East and West Africa. You're seeing South and West Africa trade happening. You're also seeing, in the last year, a lot of North African trade coming into Sub-Saharan Africa, which did not used to happen before. So today, you see Morocco wanting to come in to do a lot more, Egypt coming down wanting to do a lot more. So the dynamics are changing greatly, and all of this can be traced down to the global collapse financial crisis that we saw in the world, and also the commodities that have just generally disappeared.
Good. A bit later on, we're going to speak to His Excellency Paul Kagame, who's a champion of trying to develop on the African Union level greater integration. I want to talk about infrastructure with the both of you, because you say it's crucial to actually blossom in the space of Africa trade. Chris, you're completely a technology company. You're a digital platform that wouldn't have existed 10 years ago in this context. You're now focusing on African goods going outbound, but offering, and I thought this was a typo in my briefing notes, 8.5 billion products to Africans. That's quite, you're the Jeff Bezos plus. Plus. Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
How is the connectivity, how's the support from the infrastructure on the digital platform to support the efforts of the Mall for Africa, if you will?
Yeah, so connectivity is good. I mean, it can be better, but what Africa has done is we definitely leapfrogged, you know, with connectivity and connections. I mean, we were doing 4G and LTE way before the US even had those kinds of speeds. So, you know, the advantage of coming in late is you can get all the newer technology installed. And by getting that newer technology installed, you can do all the updates. And by doing that, people get connected faster and they're able to connect. And you can utilize different infrastructure to expand, you know, the connectivity within a country. So Nigeria, for example, I think, is a very good example of that. So we've noticed a lot of people, even in the rural areas, utilizing our app to buy products, even though you might think that they're out of the region, out of the area, but no, we've definitely seen that happen. So it's something we're proud of, providing people in the rural community with products from the States, and like you mentioned, the outbound product now. So now giving people in the rural areas the ability to sell products online to people in the States and in the UK, which is something they could only dream of, you know, back in the days.
Good. Give me a sense of the products that you're talking about. Where is there demand from the outside world into Africa for the products that you're putting on the table for them?
So from the outside in?
Yeah.
From the outside in, it's everything under the sun, to be frank. It's everything.
No, I meant, what's the demand from the outside for African products?
For African products, you have, first of all, you have clothing, jewelry, and then you have arts and crafts. Huh. Those have been the big sellers. You know, people really like the African colors, the vibrance of that, and the fact that, you know, as a company, one of the things we listened to the customers prior to launching the platform. One of the things people were worried about were things like, you know, product standards and are they going to be really high quality. So we came up with something called AMPS, which is the African-made product standard. So we launched that with the platform, and by doing that, now we've seen people really gravitate towards almost everything that we're putting on the platform, but really clothing and clothing accessories, stuff like backpacks and shoes have been really huge.
Good. Don't you have to be clever with your delivery points?
We do.
For the rural. How did you set this up? Because most of us think that Africa is held back because of infrastructure, particularly in the rural areas, because we know the migration into the major cities. How did you tackle that challenge?
Yeah, so with our first concept, which was bringing stuff into the continent. What we did is we set up what we call Mall for Africa pickup locations. So we went throughout the country. There are 38 pickup locations in Nigeria. Went throughout the country and set up pickup locations strategically.
Candidly, it seems for such a big country, very few locations, but you make that work.
We're trying. I mean, we're definitely growing, and we need more. But you have to start somewhere. We started at 2, you know.
2 to 38 is pretty good.
2 to 38 is, yeah, it's pretty good. So we're growing, but you basically take the product to a pickup location, and then that pickup location takes care of it from there.
Just quickly before we continue the discussion, I have an app here that's taking questions. So feed those in electronically. We have a microphone here in between the aisles and there. So if you want to ask a question in the last 10 minutes, I would just ask that you get to the microphones. Declare yourself, where you're coming from, and then who you'd like to see answer the question. So let's give it, another 15 minutes, and we can start opening the floor up for questions. You're free to send questions to the app now as we get started here. I think we need to spend some time with the both of you on infrastructure. And when we had a conversation behind the scenes, you were saying, you know, John, we can't think of infrastructure in the classical way of a port or a road or a modernization of the airport, because it doesn't have the ripple effect in such a rapid way. Tonye, what are you suggesting in terms of modern day infrastructure that would best serve Nigeria and best serve the continent?
Absolutely. And so a bit of background, everything from roads to ports to airports, which are traditional infrastructure people think about. We've been doing that in Africa for years, and it has not had that kind of impact. What you need today, as far as I'm concerned, is to think about infrastructure in the digital space. Now, have a digital infrastructure across board, connectivity on fiber optics, connectivity with satellites, so that the mobile phones, the deliveries, and all of that can be done. Now, once you have digital infrastructure, you begin to connect the continent in a way you never would have been able to do across with roads and airlines and all, in a quicker way. And you have the generations speaking to each other, and you suddenly find out that solutions are created in Rwanda for Nigerian products, and you don't have to leave your base. Nigeria has a huge market, and today we're seeing Kenya and Nigeria speaking a lot. Why? Because people are sitting down in Kenya and developing apps and products that work in Nigeria and vice versa. And you need to see a lot more of this happening. So for me, digital infrastructure is what I believe is the way forward, and we have to work rapidly in getting this through.
So Chris, what's missing in what Tonye is suggesting here, in your view, in terms of the digital infrastructure? I know there's been big investment from the major telecoms of Nigeria, but what's the next wave for you as a digital player?
Well, I have to echo everything he said. I think what's missing really is just more investment in that space. We need to look outside the major telcos and metropolitan hubs and start reaching out further and further and further, because as you reach out, you get more people in the rural areas connected, educated, and more involved. And that's exactly what you need. Every entrepreneur is an out-of-the-box thinker. And what you want to do is you want to tap into people who are out-of-the-box thinkers that are out in the rural areas, because they have experienced stuff that you in the metropolitan area or in the cities have never experienced.
So that's the missing link.
That's the missing link. You bring them into the fold. Now you have an amazing set of new entrepreneurs coming in with amazing new ideas that nobody ever thought of before. They're out-of-the-box thinkers. And now you're educating them. And by educating them, you're bringing in a whole new slew, a network of brand new people who are going to do amazing things. And connectivity outside the metropolitan area is key to me, mostly for education and getting the word out there that, you know, you can develop and you can make so many interesting things. And education is the key, and connectivity is what's going to drive education.
So e-education is not taking hold in Nigeria yet.
No, so it is.
It is.
But nowhere near where it should.
Yeah.
And one of the things that you see with e-education is that it also bypasses a lot of the structures that have hindered the development and connectivity and integration and interplay of personalities that we see in the world that we live in today. And the world is moving digital, and it's moving quickly digital. One of the things that I'm talking about, entrepreneurs thinking differently. We own in Lagos the largest distribution, power distribution outfit in Nigeria. Now we have rights of way all over the state, going on our electric poles, and we can take fiber optics into homes. And so one of the things we sat down thinking about is, if we're already taking electricity into homes, we might as well use that same right of way, put up fiber optics, and use that as a digital platform to provide services and connect people. It's the only way that you can begin to think in today's world. How do we move forward? How do we connect people? What's the real infrastructure that we have to bring into play? And I don't see that we have any other way to go but to push this.
It's fascinating because we're speaking about digital connectivity, and then we share the hard facts that you were suggesting because of the conversation we had beforehand, that only 1/3 of Africa has constant power.
Absolutely.
One of the things I've been focusing on, obviously, because I cover energy based in the Middle East and as emerging markets editor, it's quite extraordinary that we have this power poverty, particularly in Africa. So I'd love to get both your thoughts, though, but Chris, this would affect your bottom line. We don't have consistent power still on this gigantic continent of 1.3 billion people.
Yeah, we don't, but the ability to get everybody power is there through off-grid, different type of off-grid type mechanisms. So for example, solar and wind can be used to power homes.
Right.
And there are many, many companies in Africa that are doing that. We just need to get it out more at price points that are way less. And there's some very interesting schemes out there that are working where it's a payment plan and it's a very minute amount of money that's needed on a monthly basis to pay for solar. And by paying for solar, they're also giving you TVs and internet connectivity. So it's getting there.
Happening.
It's happening. It's just not happening as fast as we obviously would want it to happen. But it's happening, but slowly. But it is happening.
Sorry to be so blunt, because we're going to have African leaders talking later on, Tonye. Is government helping in this process, or are they leaning too much on the private sector and all these fantastic ideas that are on the table to make them click?
And that's a good question, and please put it across to each one of them. What you see is that you've had many years of government monopoly on power, and it hasn't worked. So what's happened, and what happened in Nigeria, for example, was that they decided that they were going to privatize that entire system. And they started the privatization, kicked it off. We invested in it because, again, looking to diversify from commodities, from oil and gas, which we were in, into power, was something that seemed natural to do. And the deficit is huge. So you know that there is a business there, there's a need there, there's a market there. You also know that there's funding for expansion of power, so it's there. So the funding is there, the demand is there, the funding is there, the supply is there. So what's happening? Why is it not connecting? And you find that what needs to be done are the policies that need to make this two connect easily. And that's where the challenges have been. Power and distribution of power in itself is a price issue. It's very, very difficult for governments to let go completely of the pricing because it's a tariff issue. It begins to border on social needs. But you have to find a balance. And that balance in the last couple of years is where in Nigeria we've begun to come to, working with governments and working with power companies and allowing for other sources. Solar, he was talking of the smaller solar units that go into the homes, the large solar units that you see in northern Nigeria coming in. So there are different ways, but everything ties down to the policies that the governments must put in place that allows the investment to meet the demand.
Great stuff. Okay, good. We have 20 minutes left. I wanted to ask you about one more sector that you've been working at Sahara Group, and that is the farming sector. And the reason I brought it up is because the frustration, to Chris's point, in rural Africa, a lot of hard work, a lot of grassroots organizations, a lot of NGOs on the ground. And I've heard the same figure you shared with me, 60% never makes it to the
Never makes
market.
it.
So how do we break this bottleneck? If we're talking Africa for Africa by Africa to make this thing happen, this is absolutely vital in terms of food distribution and even removing aid entirely in this space. What are you finding?
Gosh, I don't know if we have enough time to even deal with resolving Africa's problems when it comes to agriculture. What you find at the very basic level, first of all, is the access to ownership on land first. That's really where the basic problem happens. So
Access to
land, titles on land.
Right.
So you have a lot of farmers, but a lot of them are subsistence farmers, so they have smallhold farming, and they have to form cooperatives, and then the cooperatives come together, and then they collect, then they must distribute and all. So you have that level, which is very difficult. So one thing is you have to deal with the resolution of farmers, male, female, and access to land for them to produce. But that's one thing. The main aspect is after they have farmed, and harvesters, how quickly can they get their harvested crops to market? And that's where the collection points come in, the infrastructure on the roads, where you're taking it to, and you see a difficulty there. So what we did was when we saw that this was a major issue, we began to think that is it not possible to have first-line processing right at the gate of the farm, so very close to location, rather than take the raw crops out. Vegetables, within a week, if you do not begin to process them, they start going bad. So can you process and keep at the very first line the processing tomatoes and things like that at the farm gate? And we saw that this was possible. There are very, very, very basic ways of processing and keeping and preserving. And one of the things we did was work with a group like there's a group called the Roca Brothers, and they're restaurateurs, number one in the world, they're UN ambassadors. So we worked with them on preserving preservatives, very basic preservatives that you can use, techniques that you can use to save produce. And then working with the United Nations, the ILO, the SDG Fund, the UNDP, and all who are on the ground to train the farmers on this line of processing. So we set up something called Food Africa, which is a model right now that we're developing that will reduce farm waste, farm-to-market waste, we're hoping that we should be able to reduce that by half.
In which time frame?
Well, within the next year, because what we've done is we've studied, we're training, we're looking at them and saying that there are certain things that you can do with local ingredients and things that are around, because there's the sophisticated, you can bring in the huge factories, that's one way, but you always still suffer the transportation from farm there. So what we're looking at is, can we develop a model that you can use materials that you can find locally to preserve your produce and preserve it at first line market, thereby reducing your loss by at least 50% almost immediately. And it's a model that we're developing with them. We see it's begun to work. They understand it's easier than just taking those produce, collecting it to a middleman who will then take it to a factory, and half of it gets wasted even before it gets to market.
It'd be a breakthrough if we could do it.
I
want to
so.
spend 5 minutes on what drives you both. I didn't find out how old you were, Chris. How old are you now?
40.
40. So we have a 50-year-old.
You make me the old man on the panel.
A 50-year-old entrepreneur who's been in business for 21 years, celebrating your 20th anniversary in 2016. Chris is 40, setting up a digital platform. Why don't we share with some of the audience here the drive to continue to push, because there's a younger generation of business leaders that have been educated both on the continent and abroad, that are kind of hungry to knock on the door and challenge you. What do we see now with the entrepreneurs of Africa that want to be game changers?
Well, for me and the people I mentor, the drive is all about making a change and a difference on the continent and to the continent. That's pretty much ground zero. As far as I'm concerned, that's the only way to succeed is to be driven by something that means a lot to you and is something very close to your heart. Everybody that I've come across is not really motivated by money or funds, which was a way of thinking previously, but now people are more social impact driven and trying to say, look, what can I do for my country? What can I do for the continent? And I'm finding that as being the motivating factor in most. For example, when we started, or when I started Mo for Africa, I had the idea of what can I do for Africa, and I was importing items that people wanted instead of carrying the 10 suitcases on the plane with me. I decided, okay, let me turn this into a business, and bring stuff in. And as I kept on bringing items in, it dawned on me, look, I need to start helping the people here, help the people in my country, on my continent, with some kind of business. And that's where the whole out of Africa product came from. And other products, we're working on is literally just to help people in Africa. And I truly feel that in everybody's heart in Africa who's a true entrepreneur, they're not thinking of self-gain. They're thinking of what can I actually do for the continent and what can I do for my people. And if everybody has that mentality, like I was talking to you about philanthropy,
right?
So I define the philanthropy as anything one person can do for another person, period. It doesn't have to be money. It could be a social network, a connection, mentoring, whatever it is. And I've found that to be almost everybody's driving factor, and people are just so happy to contribute to the continent and make a difference and make a change, because we know we can do better for Africa if we do something for Africa.
It sounds, to be candid, it sounds very airy-fairy, altruistic, but you think it's the way you have to live. I mean, you're hiring people with that sort of spirit, is what you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's the way forward, right? If you keep on having this selfish mentality of me, you're not going to get everybody somewhere, because you're only thinking of yourself. You have to think of other people. And I truly, truly in my heart think that more people are social impact driven than they were before, because I mean that terminology is something that's really been coming up center stage recently. It's not an old terminology you were hearing 30 years ago was social impact.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's a new thing, and I truly think the next generation and the generations to come are thinking that way, and that's what I've seen at least.
Good. Tonye, you have a foundation after the success of the Sahara group. What are you trying to penetrate the most? I know what you discussed in farming, which is a vital thing, and you learned that firsthand in the field. But what's driving you now in terms of philanthropic activities, Africa for Africa?
So I think the most direct thing is influencing the next generation of Africans to do much better than we can. So we deal with education, we deal with health, but most importantly, we deal with what we call extrapreneurship, which basically means taking entrepreneurs, new entrepreneurs, those who have the ideas for entrepreneurship, and pushing them a bit more, making them into philanthropists, making them into helping other entrepreneurs. But why is that important? One of the things that we found out when we started 20 years ago was that it was so difficult to find role models, right, that we understood, role models like ourselves. And when you think about role models, especially in business, it's one thing to have role models that are from America, from the US, from the UK, from China. Yeah, it's good. But you can't quite relate with them because it's a totally different dynamics, different background, different challenges, and all of that. And so we saw at the beginning, starting off, that we had no one who could guide us. The challenges were just totally different. And so we were always at the frontier of breaking barriers, breaking new grounds on the ground. But what we saw by doing that was soon after, with everything we went in, you turn back and within 2 years, you would have a flood of other Nigerians coming in because they saw you, they remember that, hey, you're just like me. We went to the same school. I know your parents, I know who you are, I know where you came from. You're no different than I am. And if you can do this, I can. And so they come into that business and then they push you into the next because you just take a look and You have a new generation coming in. And then you move to the next level, and then another one comes in. And there's nothing we've gone into that within 3 years of us breaking into it that is not flooded with other young Nigerians coming in. And that, for me, has been the best lesson of all of this. Be a role model that people who are like you can see, understand, and what that does, it lifts up a whole generation coming up, and they lift up another generation, and they lift up another. And so you just see this huge pyramid coming in, and the base is huge. We have 180 million people, of which in Nigeria, 70% of that 180 million are under the age of 30. It's a huge base.
Yes. And an opportunity if you
opportunity.
latch onto it. The other number that stood out for me is that only 7% of the population in Africa is banked.
Yep.
40% in the Middle East and North Africa. So I always thought that was a low number. I mean, how do you have productivity? How do you have growth? How do you have e-commerce if 7% of the society is banked? How do we get over that hurdle and unlock it? Chris?
Well, I think, you know, there's a lot of technology that's coming in place that's helping the unbanked become banked, even if it's just on a mobile device. I mean, digital mobile wallets are becoming rampant. I mean, one of the people that's going to be speaking later today, his name is Tayo Viosu. I mean, he has a platform called Paga. I mean, Paga is all about mobile wallets and mobile payments. So we're now able to convert people, even if they don't have a traditional bank. We can have them moving money and moving funds on their cell phones. So they don't really have to have a bank account. They can just have a cell phone and they can do business, even on our platform. So our platform is the only platform, for example, where you can buy something from Macy's and not have a bank account whatsoever. I mean, Macy's is just one of over 200.
As long as you have the credit on the mobile platform.
Absolutely.
As long as you have the credit, that's all you need.
And that's what's happening. You see that happening a lot. So M-Pesa broke that in Africa, and everyone else is doing it.
Yep.
And so there's a huge drive right now for digital money, well, digital banking, so to speak. And the penetration of mobile phones in Africa is beyond belief.
Yeah, your cell phone is your bank account.
Well, the reason I brought up the question is I'm a little bit surprised that those that are not banked remains so low vis-a-vis the mobile penetration. I thought we would have had the breakthrough already.
Because it's always been a cash-driven society. And what you've seen now are policies that are coming in, driving people away from cash into digital money. And it's going to happen, but it's moving.
Great. Let's take some time for a couple of questions from the floor if we have them. Go ahead and come up to the microphone. If we have any on that side, we'll take two. If you can identify yourself and be quick.
Hi, my name is Tayo Viosu. I'm the founder of Paga.
There we go. Was this organized beforehand?
No, it wasn't. Actually,
not at all.
Unrelated or somewhat related. So, a question for Chris. I think it's important to share with the audience here, you know, how global e-commerce companies are looking at the African continent and how they're thinking about accessing the African consumer. So I was wondering if you could just give us a taste of what your conversations with the 200-some e-commerce companies that you work with globally.
Yeah, so one thing that we have found, or in the beginning it wasn't easy, but one thing we found as we've expanded across Africa with our platform is we found many companies are now reaching out to us and saying, how can we penetrate into the African market? You know, we know that there's a lot of money there. We know that there are a lot of people there, and they want our products, but we're unable to ship to Africa and sell into Africa because of payments. They don't understand taxes. They don't understand, you know, border regulations and laws and rules and what can be imported and not. So they reach out to companies like us to try and help them penetrate into the market, and the calls are more than you would think.
You can handle.
That's why we're at 8.5 billion, right? Because we just keep on getting calls, and we keep on adding stores to our platform and connecting US and UK companies to the continent. But what makes me more proud is the fact that we're now going to be able to help people in Africa connect their products to the US and sell their products into the US
Great.
and the UK.
I see the clock has run out here, so two quick questions and then we'll close it, please.
Yeah, John Van Heuvel. I'm from the United States. My company's First Hectares Capital. We've invested in agribusiness in Ghana. We are now developing actually special economic zone strategy for Somalia in a post-conflict scenario. My question is really this connection. We've invested in agriculture, and you've made some excellent points, both on agriculture and on sort of digital connectivity. What we have found is that the digital connectivity doesn't match with the physical connectivity.
Yes.
There's a calibration issue where the physical doesn't always keep up, of course, with the digital connectivity. So I'm interested in any comments or any ideas, maybe any success stories you've seen where that calibration went for that rural farmer, for those rural networks of farmers, where they can then connect to markets, where they can certainly connect digitally, but then connecting physically. And I can't help but make a shout out to Dubai. As an American, I have found Dubai to be not just a convenient hub for accessing the continent and being involved in deal flow, but also Dubai with special economic zones, with the way they calibrate sort of the soft infrastructure and the hard infrastructure. I can't help but think that some of that might be applicable to African situations.
Great. Thanks, John. That's for you, Tonye. I was thinking about that when Tonye was talking about trying to deal with wastage and having the people come in. You still need the infrastructure to get to market.
You do. So it's a good point. But one of the things that I believe that we need to drive is we're talking about leapfrogging. So we talked about 4G and all sorts of things. What I believe needs to happen is you allow the technology to get to location, even when the infrastructure is not there. What that begins to do is that it automatically creates a need for the supply to come out of there, to come into market, because the farmers begin to know what the price is in other places. They begin to know where their products are needed. They begin to know what type of products they need to develop. So technology brings information to them, and that information changes their habits and what they need to do. Once you're able to do that, the next thing is that as soon as you can create a market, then physical infrastructure comes. What has happened in the past and where it's been very difficult to do it is that they've waited for the physical infrastructure to get there first, and after that, then the produce comes out. I think we have to change that model completely. If we're going to do anything quickly, then we have to change the model by getting the infrastructure out there first, digital, and then you'll see the physical come in. And I agree with you, it doesn't match for now, but it will match once that demand begins to come up. And you've seen that with cell phones, with towers coming up in areas where they never thought there would be business, but people have gone there because it's happened.
Great. Very quickly on the floor, please, and then we'll wrap up the session. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Biamisola Isimi. I'm the CEO of Culture Tree. My question is for Mr. Cole. I make animated cartoons to teach children my language, which is Yoruba. I live in London. I'm a Nigerian. As an entrepreneur, what is your perspective on encouraging Nigerians in the diaspora to go back to Nigeria and contribute to economy? That's my first question. My second question is, would Sahara Group be interested in investing in the entertainment industry, for example?
Okay, so two questions and very short
One was a question, one was a sales pitch.
True. And so the answer to both is, one, the diaspora is coming in already, and it's coming in mass, en masse. So don't be left behind. It's already happening, and I believe it's going to happen even more in the next coming years. So that's a question that is easy to answer. On the second one, what you're doing in terms of education and digital education is massive. And so hold on to that. We're investing also in changing the narrative. So at the Sahara Group, we put up something called Hanatu. And on that entrepreneurship platform that I talked about, what we're doing on that platform is looking for creative minds that can tell a story through film, through technology, digital technology, and hit a market. So there's a platform that's happening already. So we can talk about this a bit more thereafter.
Thank you.
Great. I'm sure we could take a lot of questions from the floor, but we'll leave it there because nobody likes to stand in the way of a good discussion and a coffee break. I was going to say a meal, but that's not quite ready yet. That's for lunch. Thanks a lot for the questions from the floor. And gentlemen, I had a chance to only read about you in the past. to have you on the platform and actually discuss the future of Africa. A real pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thank you,
to you
John.
both. Nice
And
round of
thank you,
applause.
everyone, for having us.